Christianity, boring, untrue or irrelevant. A 33-minute presentation sponsored by the JSCSC Thursday Fellowship held at the Staff College Shrivenham on the 15th of June 2010. The speaker is Major General Retired Tim Cross CBE.
I have a favourite military quote, which you might like to remember at some stage in the future, that H.G. Wells is reputed to have said once that the professional military mind is by necessity an inferior and unintelligent mind. No man, he said, of high intellectual ability, or lady, would willingly imprison his gifts in such a calling. Well, that clearly is me. I love my military career, it was fantastic. But I don't claim to be an intellectual any more than most of you here, I suspect. But I do want to go through this subject. I want to touch on things like integrity and Christianity and leadership and the values and so forth, some of the things that we all reflect on. I didn't become a Christian until I was 30, pretty reluctantly, if I'm honest. But the impact that it's had on my life, the way I've led and so forth at various levels and on operations has led me to a point where I am very comfortable to come and talk to people about this whole issue and to challenge you, I hope, if you're not Christian, to think about the issue and to think about where does the underpinning value system for what we try to do come from. So I'm going to go through a few points. I'm going to paint a picture and try to put down some reference points. My first reference point for us as military audience, and I appreciate this is an Army comment rather than a tri-service comment, but we have in the Army decided that in our doctrine there are three components of fighting power: the measurement of the effectiveness of what we do out there when we're duffing up the Queen's enemies. They are the three physical, conceptual and moral components of fighting power. And it's interesting in the debate, and I remember it very well back in the 90s, when the debate about whether or not we had this third component, what should we call it, what did it mean, and so forth. It was about how do you get people to fight. And at the heart of it, of course, is leadership. But there are other things too. There were things like a sense of fighting for justice and righteousness. And the mantra or the strapline of the MOD emerged in this period, that we collectively are to be a force for good in the world. What do we mean by being a force for good? What do we mean by a moral component of fighting power? We could have used all sorts of other words, but those are the words that we used. And I think that it is the moral component of fighting power that separates out, in inverted commas, the good military from the bad. I was lecturing in London last night at the Royal Geographical Society at a big humanitarian conference, and I was trying to say to people, there is no such thing as the military. There are good and bad, effective and ineffective, efficient and inefficient militaries. And there are some who are state-sponsored terrorists, and there are others who, we hope, are professional, like the British forces, in bringing some value. It's not new in one sense. Napoleon once said that the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. The size and shape of your army is important, but it's not the most important issue. My second reference point is this. We are chiefly not military figures, we're people within society. We are members of the wider society from which we're drawn. We're influenced by our home, by our upbringing, by our historical traditions. We are soldiers, sailors and airmen because of the training and all the things that we've learned at the various establishments that we've been trained at over the years. But the Lord Bishop of Durham, in a lecture back in 1934 at St Andrews, said the safety and honour of Britain depends not on her wealth and administration, but on the character of her people. That character, he argued, depends on the institutions which form character, and in war it depends in particular, he said, on the military institutions which create the martial habits of discipline and courage, loyalty, pride and endurance. And those sorts of words, to me, are at the heart of the moral component. The moral component is about words like duty and honour and integrity and friendship and love. Very difficult to define, but they are much more than the issues of the physical and the conceptual components. And notwithstanding the national character and where we're drawn from, of course, we are all individuals from our own backgrounds. And we haven't got time today to go into the whole debate about nature and nurture. Who are you? Some would argue that we are largely as a result of our genetics, who our father was, who our grandfather was, and so forth. Others would argue that it's a result of our upbringing, where we went to school, our sibling rivalries, and so forth. The nature-nurture argument that we've heard debated. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but the nature-nurture debate to me is rather like the physical and conceptual debate. It's a very important part of that debate, but it is not the totality of who we are. Who we are is something broader than that. And for want of a better word, I use the word spiritual bridge, that bridges our nature and our nurture. I just want to sort of talk about that. And to try and illustrate it, imagine you're going down to London for the day, you're taking your son, in my case grandson, some of you may be nephews, nieces, whomever, and you're going to take them to London for the day, and you decide you're going to start off by going in the pod on one of the Millennium Wheel pods. And if you've been on it, you'll know that you get at the bottom, it actually goes anti-clockwise, and BA called it flying. You fly around this wheel. And you get on there with your nephew or your niece. They're about 12 or 13 years old. They're sharp, they're intelligent because they've inherited your genes, so therefore they must be, and you've raised them well. And when the pod gets to about 3 o'clock on the clock face, the child says to you, what's out there? What can I see? What goes on in these places? So you look down slightly to your left, and the first thing you can see there is House of Parliament. I'm an advisor. Well, I am still the advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee. They're just reforming the committee as a result of the election, and I may or may not be the defence advisor or the army advisor in a couple of weeks' time. But I've been in there a lot, and you look down at the House of Commons and the House of Parliament, and you explain to your child that this is a place where politics are generated and political power is distributed, and you explain about all of that. And the child is very intelligent. He asks one or two very sharp questions and nods sagely and says, yep, I understand all of that. And by now the pod has got to about 12 o'clock on the clock face of the Millennium Wheel, and you sweep your arm majestically over to the right, half right, and you point into the middle distance, and there you can see the Gherkin and the buildings, the tower blocks of the City of London. And you explain to the child about economics. You explain where economic power is generated, and economics are money and so forth is distributed, and how that works and so on. And again, the child asks you some intelligent questions and then nods sagely and says, yep, I understand that. And by now the pod is down at about 9 o'clock on the clock face. You're about to sort of dip below the horizon. And the child points to St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey and a couple of the other places in the skyline that fills the space between the city and Parliament, and says to you, what are those places for? What do they produce? What do they distribute? They're occupying prime land in the middle of London. What are they there for? How do you answer the child? I think the politics and the economics is rather like the nature-nurture. It's rather like the physical and conceptual component. In and of itself, it is not enough. Politics and economics are not enough. But the whole world of nation-states, I think we would all agree, is largely focused on those first two, which on the face of it are all that is needed to run a successful society. The state and the economy, the government and the market, politics and economics. The state, government, politics is about society, us as a collective body. We agree to abide by certain laws, which Parliament passes, recognising that it's in our collective and our individual sense and interest to do so. I drove here today, and when the traffic light turned red, I stopped. Generally speaking, we stop at a red traffic light. We can jump it, we can run it once or twice, but we all recognise if we do it on a regular basis, we're going to come unstuck. The economy, the market, is about a society made up of private individuals, us, free to trade with, to buy from, to sell to any other individual within the architecture, the framework of the law that Parliament has laid upon us. That's the essence of it. Power generated through government and politics and law and the courts, exchange mediated by the money and the markets. And nations and societies of any shade or colour around the world, generally speaking, manage those two things. Either they say there should be a law about it, or we should be free to operate within the architecture of the law. They're the physical and conceptual components, equivalents of a society. But there's a problem. I would argue there's a problem. What they leave out are some exceptionally important things, like love and duty and honour and integrity and friendship. Let's, for the sake of this debate, call those spiritual values. And what's interesting about these goods is you can't account for them in terms of politics on the one hand or economics on the other. Let's take, for example, I would argue, the most important component of the moral component of fighting power that drives you and I on operations of every one of our soldiers, sailors and airmen. Friendship. Why do soldiers die? They do not die, generally speaking, for the Queen and country. They die for their mates. Just listen to a young soldier, sailor or airman being presented, awarded with the medal, and listen to the story they tell. And it will always involve some mate or other who was in danger. Do you remember the programme, you may have seen it on Channel 4, I think it was, called Wounded, where there was a para who'd lost both his legs and both his arms, and an Irish Ranger who'd lost both his legs and one arm. And one of them said, I'm glad it was me and not my mates. Friendship is a hugely powerful driver in our business. Now, as I said, I'm a member of the House of Commons Defence Committee advisory team, and you probably don't know this, but I was there last week. Parliament's passed a law that says that you are to be my friend. Well, we know that's rubbish. You can't legislate for friendship. I knew that, so I drove down this morning, I stopped off at the bank, and I wasn't sure how many people would be here, so I got £1,000, and as you leave, I'm going to give you each £10, and I want you to be my friend. Somebody normally says, I need 50 at least. But we know that's rubbish too. You can't buy friendship. Friendship in terms of the state or the market doesn't work. It's about something else. And it's hugely important to our culture. And there's one central difference between the state and the market on the one hand and these spiritual goods on the other. We've just had a general election in this country, and we've ended up with a coalition government. Let's assume, for the sake of this debate, that Labour actually ended up in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Before the election, they were in power. After the election, they're in coalition. Do they have more power or less power as a result of having to share power? Clearly, they have less. I bring in my £1,000, I share it amongst you, I give it out. Do I end up with more money or less money? Clearly, I end up with less. Now think about the spiritual goods that I'm talking about. I share friendship with you. I share duty with you. I share honour with you. I'm a man of integrity. We work together on our ships, on our aeroplanes, our bases, and on our operations around the world. Do I end up with more of those things or less of them? Are they like money and politics? Clearly they're not. These things only exist in virtue of being shared. Unlike political power that I want to hold to myself, unlike my bank account, which I want to be as big as possible and hold to myself, I want to share these things because by sharing them, that's why they exist. And in doing that, they are increased, to use a parable, 100-fold. They're not zero-sum games like politics and economics. They only exist in virtue of being shared. I think we can now perhaps begin to answer the child's question. The churches, St Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, the churches' spires, indeed the other spiritual institutions in the city, are places where spiritual goods are produced and distributed. They're the places where we begin to understand that there is more to life than politics and economics. They're the bridge, if you like, and the moral component is like the bridge between the physical and the conceptual component. And any society that doesn't have such institutions, and I would argue, now getting a bit more personal, any individual that does not have a sense of those spiritual goods will not survive long or be a valued member of the society, or more importantly, the community in which they operate. Jonathan Sacks defines a community as a place where people know you by name and miss you when you're not there. I think it's a fantastic definition. A regiment, a company, a ship's company, a squadron in the Air Force is a place where people know you by name and they miss you when you're not there. And if it's not a place where these spiritual values and goods are present in terms of duty and honour and integrity, then that place will be much poorer for it. I have to tell you that having left the military, I have been really struck by the number of people I've met who said they were going to do things and never did them, who never really engaged in the way that we naturally tend to engage within the military community, because we are a community where friendship and honour and duty and integrity are so highly valued. I want to illustrate this with a story from the Bible. It's in the book of Judges, about 3,000 years ago. Israel are under threat from a pretty strong tribe called the Midianites, and a bloke called Gideon is called to command the army of Israel. Gideon actually doesn't want to command the army of Israel. He's not keen on being a leader. He's hiding in a wine press under the ground, and we're told that he's summoned out of this place and told, you're going to lead this army, 32,000 strong. So Gideon's the commander of an army, 32,000 strong, and in the context of the story, he prays to the Lord and says, am I going to win this battle? And God says to him, yeah, you're going to win, Gideon. But there's a problem. What's that, says Gideon. God says, the army's too big. I want you to gather the army together, and I want you to say to the boys and girls, boys in those days primarily, if you don't want to fight, go home. Now, I don't know about anybody else in the army here, but I never tried this when I was about to deploy in operations. 22,000 of the 32,000 looked at their watches and said, time for tea, got better things to do. Still too big, says God. I want you to take them down to the lake and get them to drink water. Those who lap the water like a dog, send them home. Those who bring the water to their mouths in their hands, you can keep. Not a bad military principle when you think about it, because if you're lapping the water like a dog, your head is down, you're not looking at what's going on around you. Whereas if you bring the water to your mouth, your head is up and you're looking around. 9,700 of them lap the water like a dog. Gideon's left with 300. He then goes on to fight a brilliant maneuver warfare battle. He positions the 300 on the high ground. They carry lamps and they carry vases. They light the lamps, they create the light, they break the vases, they create pandemonium, and essentially the Midianites slaughter themselves in the valley. So what's going on in the story? Defense cuts, somebody said to me the other day when I gave this lecture. Well, it's not defense cuts. But what is going on is a word or a phrase that echoes through the history, the Judeo-Christian history, but not by strength, says the prophet Zechariah, nor by might, but by my spirit, says the Lord. Not by might, not by strength, but by my spirit. Not by the physical component, not by the conceptual component, but by the moral component. That is how you will win this battle. In this case, Gideon. And Gideon, of course, does. And if we extend that into the broader society picture that I was painting earlier, if we look at the Jewish people and the Christians when they first started, they were tiny. The Jews have always been a small number of people, relatively. Christianity was a tiny sect in its early period, yet they both survived. 2,000 years in terms of Christianity, 4,000 years in terms of the Jews. Meanwhile, the great empires that seemed invincible at the time and throughout history, some of those that we've seen in the places that we've deployed over the years. I went to see Nebuchadnezzar's palace in Iraq and one or two of the other sort of sites like that. The Egyptian Empire, the Syrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, which Nebuchadnezzar was head of, the Persian Empire, ancient Greek, ancient Rome, all of those, all the way through to Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, Soviet Union, have collapsed and fallen. And yet Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and the other great faiths have survived through that. Why is that? Nietzsche wrote in the 1870s a series of books attacking the values of Judaism and Christianity. And he said this, his argument was very simple. He said what was natural to human beings is the will to power. What's wrong with Judaism and Christianity, he said, is that they're unnatural in putting right above might, compassion above ruthlessness. Instead of power, they're concerned with the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the vulnerable. Nietzsche's case was that Judaism and Christianity were an inversion of natural instinct. They would never produce, he argued, a society of strong, free human beings. Now, he wasn't a Nazi, but Nazi Germany picked up those ideas and really took them to their logical conclusion, with, of course, catastrophic results. The evidence of history is that those civilizations that value right rather than might, that care for the vulnerable as much as for the strong, that defend the sanctity of life and fight for the rights of individuals, have been the ones that have flourished. No political system that denies those things has ever survived for very long. The Third Reich was going to last 1,000 years. It survived for 12. Soviet communism was going to be the end of history. Everybody was going to become a communist. It lasted 70. Why? Because if you demoralize society, if you do not accept that there is a moral component, if you do not accept the spiritual values, if you take out of the equation everything that we've alluded to, if you lose a moral vision, then that society or that community will collapse and implode on itself. Normally from within, actually. I know that's not the case in Nazism. That's why the moral civilizations survive and non-moral ones or immoral ones do not. That's the meaning of not by might nor by strength, but by my spirit. So what does that mean for us? Well, I would argue that in terms of the values that we hold dear to, discipline and leadership and courage and so forth, that underpinning those words are these moral values. Operations are by their very nature physically and mentally demanding, extremely unpredictable, potentially dangerous, characterized by uncertainty, by fear, by fatigue, by discomfort. General Rupert Smith, who I served with a lot over the years, described war as the province of uncertainty. Such operations are a group activity, we all know that. Whether the task is a full-scale war or a peace support operation or support to civil authorities in the time of crisis, everyone is a part of a team. And the effectiveness of the whole depends on each individual, seen or unseen, playing his or her part. We are a fighting organization molded by discipline and controlled by leaders. And that's the key point. Leadership needs to be decisive and calm in a crisis and so on. And rather than being imposed from above, the basis of all leadership and discipline, I would argue, comes from within. Whatever its source, it involves the idea of a self-control and self-restraint. And that underlies the whole of Christian and most other religious teaching. Personal conduct is impressed upon all of us in all sorts of different ways. And it used to be impressed on every child in this country from nursery school onwards, in terms of things like the Ten Commandments and so forth. Leadership and discipline imply a concept of duty. Nothing will be accomplished in a crisis by soldiers, sailors or airmen without a sense of duty. The sentry in an outpost holds ground in the face of an attack because he knows he has a sense, or she has a sense of duty to those behind them. We instill the fact that it is right to obey orders because we want to ensure that people do hold firm in times of difficulty. But remember, generally speaking, for the soldiers, sailors and airmen, this concept of duty is not about abstracts like freedom or democracy or empire. It's about friendship. I'm awake on duty, my mates are sleeping, and in 2 hours' time I'm going to be one on sleep. And I want to know that the bloke who's then guarding me is doing it properly. So leadership and discipline seek to conquer fear, the uncertainty of operations, by welding us into a cohesive whole, united by obedience to orders, creating a body strong enough to carry each member through danger and difficulty which alone they would be unable to face, but together they hold firm. That's the immune system, the antibody to rampant selfish individualism on the one hand, reflected in the wider economic life of society, and the overbearing state on the other, reflected in the political power play. Leadership and discipline are part of the moral component. Viscount Slim said, any military organisation today without such discipline is no more than a mob, alternating between frightened sheep and beasts of prey. Discipline, as the old British soldier, amongst others, had demonstrated in peace and war, is the old Christian spiritual value of unselfishness, of standing by your neighbour, your comrade. It is the sacrifice of comfort, inclination, safety, even your life for others, for something greater than yourself. It is the refusal to be the weak link in the chain that snaps under the strain. Let's just look at integrity. I was serving in the newly formed DLO a few years ago, and Sam Cowan was the first of the CDLs, the Chief of Defence Logistics. And I was with him walking down a corridor when a young civil servant, no more than 30, met this 4-star general. Those of you who know Sam will know that he's not a man to be trifled with. She walked up to him boldly and confidently and said, "General, what can I pray for you?" Sam looked at her and said, "Pray that I may maintain my integrity." It was fascinating, really fascinating moment. I subsequently had a lot of conversations with Sam. He's a great guy. Integrity, he wanted to be prayed for, strength that he could preserve his integrity. Integrity within the leadership and with the men and women we lead and with whom we work cannot be compromised. It's why we take it so seriously. It's why we take discipline and so forth so seriously. From honesty and integrity flow the ability to deal with the conflicting realities, complex emergencies in a fair and balanced way. One of the charities I'm a trustee of goes to Eastern Europe and Africa and various other places lecturing on leadership, and particularly Christian leadership. And I was in Lithuania 3 or 4 years ago now, and I was asked by an officer from Azerbaijan, when the British Army was deployed in places like the Balkans, he asked, "How do you know which side you're on?" It was very difficult to explain to him that we weren't on anybody's side, that was the whole point, that we were neutral and fair-minded to everybody. And such an attitude, I would argue, is not new for us. But integrity, like so many other things, like moral courage, for example, cannot be taught. It must be a part of the framework of the community in which we live, built into the architecture. A good military organisation takes seriously issues like the Geneva Convention, the laws of armed conflict, the rules of engagement, the concept of the just war. I hope we still do. I hope we debate them and teach them. And I think they've really come back to life in Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of the deployments we've been on over the last few years. Civilized behaviour requires self-control, self-discipline to be built on the foundations of integrity at the personal and corporate and the group level. It marks out a civilized soldier and a civilized military from the brute. This doesn't mean that there's a superabundance of integrity in every soldier. Of course it doesn't. But it does mean that within the organisation there is a determination to get that very much at the centre of who we are, to build our moral component around it. And it must be absolutely, in my view, instinctive in us, the officer corps. It's too late to have a debate with ourselves when things are going badly wrong around us. Lord Moran, in his book The Anatomy of Courage, he was Churchill's doctor. Fantastic characters, well worth a read. I contend, he said, that fortitude in war has its roots in morality, that selection is a search for character, and that war is but one more test, the supreme and final test, if you will, of character. Character, he argues, as Aristotle taught it, is a habit, the daily choice of right instead of wrong. It is a moral quality which grows to maturity and peace and is not suddenly developed at the outbreak of war. Man's fate in battle is worked out long before the war begins. When we climb up the steps of the aeroplanes to fly to Afghanistan, it's too late for somebody to say, "Have you zeroed your weapon?" It's too late for somebody to say, "Come on, let's go for a run and get fit." We've had to do that in the months and indeed the years previously to those deployments that can come around very quickly. I remember September the 12th, 1990, I had been an instructor at the Army Staff College at Camberley. I handed over, went out to Germany on the 10th of September, took command with a glass of champagne. At midday on the 12th of September, it was a Wednesday, and at 1 o'clock I was summoned to the DCOS office and said, "Start preparing the supply and logistic plans. We're off to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait," basically. It had happened overnight, caught everybody by surprise. It's too late for me to then think about zeroing a weapon and going for a run to get fit. And it's certainly too late for me to start thinking about the moral qualities and the issues that we're going to need in this campaign and so on. Good military organizations demand leaders who build up self-belief in others, encourage the gifts that are present in everyone, and leaders who confront wrong, recognize it and deal with it, not condoning it or walking away from it. Leaders who have a sense of spiritual truth, who can recognize when it is right to lay force aside and work to establish peace. To fight when necessary, for example in the Falklands or the Gulf or Iraq or Afghanistan, and then to stop the shelling on the retreating enemy. I remember having a discussion with the artillery commander in the Falklands as the Argentinians fell back on Port Stanley. Now, like all these things, it's not black and white and easy. We were actually very short of ammunition, it has to be said. We all know that. But they stopped shelling the retreating Argentinians because it was just the right thing to do. Captured POWs. And when we get it wrong, as we do at Abu Ghraib and other places, we all know how significant that is, how much it hurts us. General Mike Jackson and people like Rupert Smith, deeply hurt by what went on in these places because people had failed to live up to the standards of integrity and honesty and so forth that we expect of them. Such leaders stand aside and separate from those who led the slaughter of women and children in the Far East and Europe in World War II, ethnically cleansed the villages and towns throughout Bosnia and Croatia and Kosovo where many of us served, or places like Cambodia or other countries around the world. These things lie at the heart of the moral component. And we who've set ourselves out from the rest of society to lead others in this most demanding of environments, I think need to understand this. And I think, unfortunately, we've lost a bit of sight of it. Leadership is a lonely business. Bill Slim, perhaps the greatest commander, I think, of World War II, tells of a moment late in the retreat from Burma in the face of the Japanese in 1942 when he faced his staff and a number of Chinese staff officers. They stood there silent, he said, and they looked at me. All commanders know that look. They see it in the eyes of their staff and their men when things are really bad, when the toughest soldiers want holding up, and where they turn where they should turn for support from their commander. And sometimes you just don't know what to say. You feel very much alone. When Colonel H. Jones was killed in the Falklands, you probably know the story of Chris Keeble stepping in to take over command. As Chris Keeble took over command, he went to one side from the rest of the battalion, knelt in the heather, took a prayer from his pocket and prayed. It was not by chance that he carried a prayer in his pocket. And he tells the story of how he felt a sense of certainty and warmth about what he was to do, and he sent out the envoys to seek the Argentinian surrender. And of course they surrendered. I've been in similar situations at various times over my career as doing EOD work in Northern Ireland and places around the world and so forth. And I do think, leading into the hub of why we're here today, that I want to challenge you and get you to ask yourself some questions. Are you confident that this is embedded in the UK MOD now, in the UK military? Or have we lost some sight of it? I don't want to overplay it. General Bradley, the US commander in France in 1944, said this: "Humanity is in danger of being trapped in this world by its moral adolescence. Our knowledge of science has clearly outstripped our capacity to control it. Mankind is stumbling through a spiritual darkness whilst toying with the secrets of life and death. We've too many men of science," he said, "and too few men of God." Now, he did not mean we don't have enough vicars. He meant we do not have enough of you and me who have a sense of spiritual truth. We've grasped the mystery of the atom, rejected the Sermon on the Mount. The world has achieved brilliance without wisdom, power without conscience. We are a world of nuclear giants and ethical infants. And I think that resonates as strongly today as it did when he said it 70 years or so ago. And I'm worried. I'm worried that we, the British military community, are losing sight of the reality of the danger of us becoming a community of ethical infants. The very fact, actually, that we had to write a values and standards booklet in all three services of one form or another. Actually, the very fact that we had to think about a doctrine that came up with the moral component of fighting power is a reflection of the nature of the society and so forth. One stage, I've got to be careful what I say because it may not be true anymore, but at one stage at Sandhurst, people wanted to take out all references to Jesus Christ and Christianity. The booklets on leadership were going to be sanitized to include phrases like the moral code of leadership. Rooted in what, one may ask? It may be unfashionable, but I think this is dangerous nonsense, and I think we really need to work as the officer corps to think this through and bring it back to some sort of focus. We live today in what's been described, and I think it's a good expression, a cut flower society. Our civilization is embedded in the earth of Judeo-Christianity. That's where the UK comes from in terms of its history. Our standards of morality and ethics have grown out of that biblical earth. And those who want to remove themselves from those foundations are like those who cut flowers from the ground and put them in a vase. They look fine for a while, but we know two things about cut flowers in vases. One is they die pretty quickly, and the other is they do not cast fresh seed into the ground to enable new growth and new life to emerge. Cut flowers never reach their potential, never spread their seeds to create new life. And like cut flowers, I would argue, leaders who separate themselves out from or deny their spiritual heritage will find that their standards will die. And no amount of well-meaning, nice-sounding platitudes will change that. Integrity and honor and duty and these things do not stem and come from overnight discussions. They don't appear like magic when the going gets tough. They need to be inculcated and lived day by day. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves facing a continuous stream of embarrassing press headlines and so forth, which will damage us. But more importantly, they will destroy our moral component, and we will not continue to succeed on operations. So the question is, where do they come from? Now, I am a Christian. As I said earlier, I became a reluctant Christian. I'm not saying I want everybody to go to church every 5 minutes and all the rest of it, but I do want us to recognize that it is in Christ and the Bible that I think we have a large chunk of what we're talking about. I absolutely recognize there are other faiths, and I would say to people to explore those other faiths if that's what you want to do. But I have found my home in Christ and in Christianity, and from my relationship with Christ, these words have become far more important to me in the last 20 years, and I have commanded differently as a result of it. It's not easy, and get it wrong every day. Of course we do. We always get it wrong. In the same way that some days we have lousy days on the ranges, and some days we feel lousy when we're on a run or whatever else it is. But my argument is that this is a key part of who we are as a community and who we should be as individuals, as parents, as brothers, as sisters, as sons and daughters, as members of the society in which we live. There's nothing wrong with politics and economics. They're hugely important. There's nothing wrong with the physical and component of fighting power. They're hugely important. Without them, we wouldn't win. But if we don't get a sense of this, then I think we are in danger of losing something. And courses like the Alpha Course or other opportunities of conversation and so forth are an opportunity for us to grapple with these issues and share with each other the difficulties that we find with them. It used to be said that you never talked about sex, politics and religion in officers' messes. Well, I never thought that was true in the first place. But actually, there's not many better places over a beer to talk about some of these issues because they are important, particularly the spiritual issues.
Please note that any views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official thinking and policy of their organisation, Her Majesty's Government, or the Ministry of Defence. Major General Cross can be contacted by email at crosstc, spelt Charlie Romeo Oscar